Mhm. Hello. Uh, Thank you for coming to the webinar where, is there an echo? There isn't it. Thank you for coming to the webinar where I'm going to talk about the Sweden case of the Transit Coasts project. I'm going to wait about 1 or 2 more minutes before starting it in earnest because there are a bunch of people that I know are coming here, and sometimes people are just late. And so I'm going to have a mixed audience. And this means that I'm going to say some things that are going to make parts of the audience say, "Oh yeah, duh," because I know that some of the people here, for example, came from the Swedish planning and academic community. So if I tell you guys about like what Stockholm is, you're going to say yes, of course. But I also know a bunch of Americans who maybe don't know much about this, but do know what we're doing at the Transit Coasts project. So please bear with me. I promise that I'm not just informing you that the wheel is round and has spokes. So I'd like to ask people if you can look at the chat. If you have questions, you can post them in chat, and Eric and Elif and I will see them. I'm probably not going to see them as easily because I'm going to be looking at presentation related matters, but I will look later. So let me start. Let me see if I can share my screen on this. Okay. So the Stockholm case is about how the construction costs in Stockholm are, on the one hand, in absolute numbers, the construction costs are on the low side, but it's getting worse. So the construction costs of Stockholm of a generation ago, 2 generations ago, were excellent. And today they're merely pretty good. And the question is, what's happening? What lessons can other people, again, most of the world has higher construction costs than Sweden. What can people learn from Sweden, but also what can Sweden maybe learn from itself to avoid the ongoing increase? So for the benefit of people here who maybe know Sweden, but don't know what we are at the Transit Coasts Project. The Transit Coasts Project, it's transitcoasts.com. It is an investigation into how much it costs to build urban rail tunnels. So I'm saying metro construction, but this also includes commuter rail tunnels that are not metros. And these construction costs differ by a very large factor. So the most expensive in our database, even if you only look at regular metros, not commuter rail, is Second Avenue subway in New York City. In 2022 PPP dollars, this is about $2.2 billion a kilometer. The cheapest lines that are still fully underground are maybe a little bit less than 100 million per kilometer. So what we're doing is a kind of mixed method program where we're both looking at a database, but we're also doing 5 case studies. The case studies being Boston, Istanbul, Italy, Stockholm, and New York. And I'm going to motivate in a little bit why several Italian cities can form a single case. And now most of the work that's been done on this, of which there is quite a lot, probably the most famous would be Bent Fluvbjer, is about cost overruns. So Fluvbjer, and again, not just Fluvbjer, but also someone like Bert van Vee or Peter Love, who doesn't think well of Fluvier and his work at all. What they do is they study cost overruns. So cost overrun means planners said at the beginning of the project that it would cost X, it actually costs Y, and Y is a lot more than X. What's going on? What we do is we don't care about X versus Y, we just care about Y. So we care about the actual cost and how it compares with actual costs of other projects. So I'm going to talk about cost increases quite a lot in this presentation. And the cost increases are going to be not cost overruns relative to budget, although that regrettably has happened in Sweden, but cost increases relative to previous final costs of different projects. So we have a database that we have just expanded to 900 items, of which, how many are in China? Do we think it's 2/3, maybe 60% of this 20,000 kilometers? So 50 something countries are represented in the database. I think it's 58 or 59 if you count Hong Kong and Taiwan as countries. When it comes to planning, Hong Kong and Taiwan are countries. Hong Kong, even today, is a country when it comes to planning. Like, it's very, like, if you look at the way the MTR is built, it's very different from how it's done in the PRC proper. The database says our average is $200 million a kilometer, but this includes elevated lines, and this includes old numbers that are not yet sanitized. In today's money, for purely underground, it's 300. So you should think of this as the global average. This is pulled up by outliers, like, again, Second Avenue Subway, for example, but there can't be that many outliers. The reason that we started this is we're rooted in New York. I'm not based in New York right now. I live in Berlin, but Eric and Elif live in New York. It started with an investigation of the construction costs in New York.
Oh, it looks like we have a frozen Alon. That's a problem, of course. Let me see what Alon, if Alon is available. I think what Alon was going to say is that, yes, two of us are in New York and Alon's in Germany. But when we started digging into this issue, it was because of high construction costs in New York that got us interested in it. And so we always wanted to dig more deeply into what was going on here in New York. But in order to contextualize everything, we needed to grab data from around the globe. And so now we have this database that has, I think it's 903 projects in it. It's true, like 650 of them are from China. But more important, we start to see how costs vary from country to country, and that sort of on average, American costs, especially for underground projects, were just much higher than any other country in the world. And on the lower cost side, which is we decided for our research that we wanted to examine sort of outlier cases to understand who's really doing things well, who's really doing things poorly. If we had more time, we probably should also do the median case to see, well, what's just the average. And so we chose Sweden because it has extremely low costs and it's a rich country, which makes it different from our Istanbul case and our sort of Italian case. And that's really all I can say right now until Alon gets back. But let me see. Alon is restarting their computer, so should be back in just a few moments. I don't have a stand-up routine prepared, but if anyone has, a question about sort of what we're doing, I guess I can talk just a little bit about things we're going to do in the future. So we have one more case that is outstanding, which is our New York Second Avenue Subway case, which is pretty much done. We're just putting some bows on it, so to speak. And then we're going to also put out a final report that has sort of an intro and a conclusion with some recommendations about how to sort of build to lower costs in North America in particular. And then after that is all wrapped up, we are looking at high-speed rail on the Northeast Corridor. And how to sort of deliver that in a more cost-effective manner, taking the same approach of, well, what's going on in other parts of the world. And we've released a little bit of that work to date, but we haven't dug so deeply into all of that. And then we're also working on a very specific project related to a potential light rail or heavy rail project here in New York, the Interborough Express, which would be connecting Brooklyn and Queens. The governor at the beginning of 2022 sort of made a big announcement that we were moving forward with it. We'll see sort of what happens after the election, of course. But our interest in that project is, we'll look at the costs, of course, but we're also very interested in sort of the interaction with land use, and specifically, what does transit-oriented development mean in a city like New York, where sort of from the American perspective, it's the most transit-oriented city. But as you move farther out from sort of the center of sort of Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn and I guess early parts of Queens, you have lower density single family housing. All right, Alon is back. I will stop with my terrible ad-libbing. All right.
I am sorry, my computer froze on me. I don't think I need to explain more about who we are at TCP, but I do want to point out that the costs are mostly a feature of what country the project is in, and if it's not like that, then there's a reason. The reason can be something that I can explain in geological terms. So in Shanghai, costs are substantially higher than in the rest of China. And yes, Shanghai is also maybe a very rich city, and Shanghai is also a huge city. So the lines that are currently being built in Shanghai it's no longer line one open. I wouldn't say line one opened a generation ago, but in China, they also are building very fast. Right now, they're building like lines with numbers in the high teens. I think maybe they've crossed 20. But Shanghai is also very expensive in comparison with, for example, Beijing, which isn't the exact same boat. Very wealthy, so high wages, and also very complex, and also Shenzhen, Guangzhou. However, Shanghai has alluvial soil. Shanghai is kind of the Netherlands of China, both in the sense of geology and the sense of being kind of historically, partly because of its location, kind of like historically the wealthiest part of the country. And in Amsterdam, there have been problems with building metros that are not purely institutional. The soil, the alluvial soil, is terrible for metro building. Sometimes I cannot give you the exact reason for what happened, but I do know that, for example, Nuremberg has distinctly, not extremely, but distinctly lower costs than the rest of Germany. The one project we have in our database is a little bit less than 300 million a kilometer, and the projects from maybe 10 years ago were noticeably cheaper than the projects from, let's say, Berlin or Hamburg. But also Nuremberg is very different. So I can't tell you what is causing the somewhat lower costs of Nuremberg, but I can tell you that Nuremberg plans things differently from the rest of Germany. Nuremberg is a city that is built. Nuremberg has a full U-Bahn. It has a full metro, grade separated. And at this point, they're building driverless lines, which is atypical for Germany. Germany does have full underground lines, but only in very large cities. That is to say, Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. Other German cities the size of Nuremberg will be building light rail tunnels, Stadtbahn in German. And for my Swedish viewers, this is the pre-metro, like the tunnels built at the very beginning in Stockholm. The one in Södermalm that was incorporated into the Green Line. And for Americans, this is like the current Green Line in Boston or Muni Metro, subway surface tunneling. and Nuremberg doesn't do that. So Nuremberg is atypical. So when costs are different, there is an explanation. And this is why New York and Boston are two separate cases. New York is atypically expensive even for America. But it's not just the country, it's also the macro region. So the Anglosphere is a macro region. It has very high construction costs. And if you're wondering why this list and why I'm not, for example, dividing the world into Europe and Asia, this is where the mixed methods come in. In Singapore and in Hong Kong, you can kind of trace the British influence on both of them. In metro planning, you can see it in the shape of the network. You can see certain Londonisms in Singapore and in Hong Kong. And this is also institutional. For example, consultants might be working in London and in Singapore, but less likely London and Paris. So it's not just this is a region with high costs, it's also high cost history. Now the US is somewhat, let's put the US aside a little bit, because in New York, their high costs go back to the 1930s. But in the rest of the Anglosphere, the cost explosion was very simultaneous. In London, I can't tell you when it happened in London, because London hasn't built enough underground lines in the last, I don't know, 80, 90, 100 years to have a very accurate cost history. But it's built some. Costs were reasonable in the 60s. The rise is either 70s or 80s. And in the smaller countries, in those that have a long enough history, which is mostly Canada, it's later. There's a really good study about this by Stephen Wickens about Toronto that documents how the costs exploded starting in the late 90s. Singapore was building cheaply in the 80s and 90s, Hong Kong, and all of these three countries kind of, the explosion is mostly at 2000s and onward effect. And this also includes Quebec. So Quebec behaves like the rest, but like English-speaking Canada. It's not exactly the language. And I bring all of this up because this will relate with the Nordic situation. Now, the Nordic region has cheap construction costs. How cheap? Some of the lines, even from within the century, were for not much more than 100 million a kilometer. There are some lines, there are a bunch of sub 200 million a kilometer lines. It's hard to give great Nordic examples because before Nötenelbanan, the last time Sweden built a metro line was a very short extension in the early 90s. But in Norway and in Finland, there are such examples. That is to say, Lørenbanen in Norway and the first phase of Länsimetro in Helsinki, and these were cheap. And then things exploded in both of these cities, in Oslo and in Helsinki. And in Stockholm, it kind of feels exploded as well, in the sense that it's had a large cost overrun. I know you might say, oh, it's an overrun, but no, I mean, peer cities that built multiple projects separated by maybe 10 years have seen a real cost increase. So it's actually interesting to study this region and ask, why was it cheap, and why is it still cheap-ish, but not as much as before? So let's talk about the situation of Sweden. So the T-bana begins in the 1940s. The opening was in the 50s. The construction began in the 40s. Now, Sweden is kind of, so in international development, it's a little bit of a Kerala model of social development first, economic second. Which I'm not going to talk about Kerala, but in Sweden's case, it's been successful. The Sweden of, let's say, the early 20th century, I believe, is the country with the world's lowest child mortality rate. I think it was the first country in the world to go below 100 in 1,000. But economically, it was not an early industrializer. I mean, the industrial revolution began in Britain, then it expanded to the US, into the urban parts of Germany. Sweden industrialized later. The Stockholm County of the middle of the 20th century is not a large city. It's about it's 900,000 people in the county in 1940, 1.1 million in 1950. And if you're coming into this idea of the 1940s and 50s as an era of prosperity, because maybe you have an American way of thinking, of conceiving of the middle of the 20th century, this is not how Sweden looked at all. A hefty share of the Swedish working class did not have full indoor plumbing, or maybe they only had cold and not hot water. Very high levels of overcrowding. And travel difficulties. The problem was it was difficult to build housing outside the city when in the Sweden of, let's say, 1940, in the Sweden of 1950, most people don't own a car. Now in the Sweden of 2022, yeah, most people own a car, and people who don't own a car, for the most part, it's because they can afford to rely on mass transit. This is not mid 20th century Sweden. So they have to stay close to city center because public transport maybe is not very fast. The trams are not very fast. They're very crowded, and this leads to just very high levels. Not necessarily density, people per square kilometers, but people per built up area. So now there's also an era of state-led development. Is this an era in which, I think it's to a large extent all of Western Europe, but I know this specifically of Sweden, was building a bureaucratic apparatus that is based on apolitical expert opinion. Some of this persists to this day. For example, road projects in Sweden. This is the work of Eliasson, Börjesson et al. About it actually contrasts Sweden with Norway, and somehow Norway, which is otherwise very similar to Sweden, doesn't do this. So there's benefit cost analysis for every project, and in Sweden, this actually is a big influence on which, again, these are sort of small road projects, which road projects get funded. Now, Trafikverket did not exist in the 50s because it comes from a merger of a road and rail administration, and these two have institutional changes. The rail administration having come from 1980s reforms, but it's this, but the bureaucracy kind of persists through these changes. It's just changing the organizational chart, and specifically there was inspiration by the Thomas McDonald era of American road building. So this was an era of extreme levels of technocracy, and often shielding from politicians. In the United States, this led to a kind of slush fund situation in which the BPR had its own budget that was not approved by Congress, essentially, through user fee lockboxes, and this essentially led to the construction of a large in-house planning team that would be, and to a large extent still is, very responsible for planning and design, although today more work is done in collaboration with private consultants. That's the institutional situation. The construction, importantly, was coordinated. So this is, I believe, the construction of T-Centralen. This is the meeting point of the green and red lines. The third line, I mean, it's also the meeting point of the blue line. So the three lines, the green, red, and blue, would all meet at a single point. And they meet at T-Centralen, the green and the red meet at a cross-platform interchange. It's a 3-station transfer, whereas the blue line meets them, but it's on a separate level. So it's a kind of more typical, you need to walk long distances to see it type of transfer. And this is because this was all planned as a as a single multi-line system. They didn't do, oh, let's build one line. This line is busy. Let's build a second line. So because of this kind of coordinated planning, even on the level of integration between lines, the quality is very good. Now, the most important coordination was with development. So this is an aerial pic of Vallingby from I think it's 1958. And the idea here is the ABC program, Arbet, work, bostad, housing, and C is for centrum. The idea is that these would be new towns. The metaphor was a string of pearls. So the idea is you have a metro line, in this case it's the green line, coming out of city center, and it has stations, and around each station, this is the station, there would be this kind of pearl, and then the next station would have its own pearl, where the idea is that you would have not just relatively high housing density. The Stockholm metro region, if you just look at population per urban square kilometer or something, that's not a very dense area. It's just that the density has a structure, the structure being a neighborhood center with commercial uses right on top of the train station, multi-story residential right behind, and then lower density would be lower residential density would be farther out. This was generalized 10 years later into the 10-year million program, in which in 10 years, 1 million housing units were built in a country of 8 million people with not much population growth. This was, again, about creating a situation where the working class would be able to live in much better living conditions. And in the Stockholm region, this was transit-oriented development, TOD, due to which, so first of all, the construction was just low. It's about 50 million a kilometer. Not all of it was underground, but the majority is. But the ridership is this high. The cost per weekday rider, so the cost of the original system per weekday rider today in 2022 dollars is about $3,600 per trip. And to put this in perspective, I cannot think of a single metro line in the world built in the last generation that is that inexpensive. I can think of a handful that are below 10,000. This was 3,600. And yes, it was built in a much poorer country. So the benefits were the benefits for a much poorer country. And yet, there's a paper by Bergerson that says that the exposed benefit cost ratio of this is 6.5. And with all this extensive TOD, so this is Vallingby today, this kind of neighborhood center. The ridership is so high that the model split, I believe it's a little less than 40% for all trips, for work trips, which is a little bit maybe more comparable with some other parts of the world, would be most likely a little bit more. So most likely about the same as Metro Paris. Ile-de-France is 43% model split for public transport for work trips for INSEE. There are some huge rich Asian cities that are in the 50s, but I mean, Stockholm, the fact that Stockholm is comparable to Paris, and Stockholm again is not a large metro area. Stockholm today is about 2.5, 2.6 million. That is pretty impressive. And that needs to be understood as the success of that kind of plan. So now let's talk about not stuff that happened 60, 70 years ago, but stuff that's happening, I won't say today, but mostly the last 25 years. Sweden had a lot of economic growth, this kind of state-led planning in the 50s, 60s. It did not do as well in the 80s. I don't know the exact point in which growth slowed down, I don't remember, but late 70s and 80s were not a good time. And then in the early 90s, there was the financial crisis. However, growth since then, so growth since, not since the bottom of the crisis that we're cheating, but since the beginning of the crisis in Sweden has been very healthy. Per capita GDP growth I believe the fastest growing developed country since 1990. So 1990 to 2019, so just before Corona, I think number one would be Australia. Among the countries that were considered developed, so I'm not going to count, let's say, South Korea, which was middle income in 1990. And then narrowly behind, they think it's a very near tie between Sweden, Norway, and the United States. So economic growth, also quite a lot of population growth. In fact, population growth has already reached 2030 estimates that were made in the 2000s because of high immigration levels. And so the existing transport system has struggled. So this led to two big plans. The first is Citybanan. This is a commuter rail tunnel. This is because before Citybanan, there were only 2 tracks worth of capacity through central Stockholm on all Swedish railways. So your intercity train to Göteborg or to Malmö or to Linköping, and then all of the regional trains would have to funnel through that same 2-track bottleneck, and they managed to squeeze 24 trains per hour through it, which is pretty impressive on a system that is a combination of commuter, longer range regional, and intercity, but it's still only 24. So they've since built another 2-track tunnel, currently designed around 16 trains an hour with future expansion to 24. This is a 6-kilometer tunnel with 2 stations. Stockholm City, which is on level -3. Remember, I mentioned before that Tessentralen was the Tessentralen was built as 2 levels, one for the green and red, one for the blue. This is beneath both of them. It's a 4-track station. It's a large cavern because the commuter trains are bigger. This is why commuter rail in our database is consistently more expensive than normal metros. And Nytunnelbanan, which is a longer expansion. This is 3 directions, northwest toward an undeveloped, for the most part, area called Barkarby, due north to the suburbs in Solna to Arenastaden, and then southeast that has 2 branches, one to the relatively lower density suburb of Nacka, and farther south to take over one of the 3 branches of the Green Line to permit more frequency. This is a big cost overrun. So this was supposed to be 23 billion kronor. It rose to 32, and they've heard that they're talking about how it's going to be more. The highest number I've seen is that it might be 52. Now, I don't think it's 52 in 2016 prices. I think it's 52 in year of construction prices, which are in the 2020s, and this is an era of high inflation. So this is not another 2/3. This is not a real overrun of 2/3 from this level. The possible overrun is much less. And I want to say something, that these are not projects that passed benefit cost analysis, which has left some poor taste in the mouth of some people. Both of them had a benefit cost ratio that was supposed to be a little bit below 1. But this is very strange. So Citybanan is already open. We can see how much ridership it has. And we can even maybe net out the old commuter rail ridership before it opened. And that cost per rider looks pretty healthy. I mean, it's not 3.6 thousand per rider because that just does not exist. It's, I think, 28, maybe in 2 days when it will be almost 30,000. 30,000 looks high, but it looks high mostly if you compare it to the dollars of 10 years ago. I mean, lines are being built currently with good benefit cost analyses elsewhere for approximately that cost per rider. If you take into account that Sweden is something like 2.5 times as rich as it was in the 60s when the original T-Bana was built, its ability to afford this. So if you apply this kind of, let's say, multiplier of 2.5, then 30 becomes 12. Or if you will, the 3.6 from the 60s, let's multiply and divide, that becomes about 9. And that 9 has a benefit cost ratio of what, 6.5? Yeah, 30 should be above water. 30 should be maybe a little bit less than 2, which is not the sort of mouth-watering return on investment that you would be able to see retrospectively from the original T-bottom, but it's well above 1. So I don't know why the benefit cost ratio was so negative. At any rate, both of them were agreed upon, even under a right-wing government. This was so both of these were greenlit in the Reinfeldt era, so when the alliance was in charge, and not the Social Democrats. And even then, this was not politicized. The decision of where to go was based on the shape rather than serve model. So this is Bakarby. This is the existing line in lighter. It goes up to Okada, and you can kind of see, even on this kind of map, development here, less development farther out. And the plan is to kind of do the same thing around here, around Bakarby. A lot of this planning is also based on negotiations about TOD. I know in Oslo, Fornebubanen is being built specifically as a negotiation to a suburb that maybe did not want to build more housing, but the state told them, okay, if you build this more housing in these locations, we will give you a subway to your city center jobs. This is something that works very well in very monocentric cities where you can expect that quite a lot of the jobs will be in city center, which is the case, for example, in Stockholm. So this kind of planning, it's not politicized at all, even if the yes or no decision on a mega project is never not political, but it's political at the level of, we are on an austerity budget, we're not going to build marginal projects, or we're social democrats, we like spending money on public transport. It's kind of that macro level of politicization, not we have an important member of our party from this region, let's build them a tunnel. It doesn't work like this in the Nordic countries. So very good planning. Now the physical construction is very difficult to compare with other things. Why is it difficult to compare with other things? Because basically everyone globally uses TBMs, and then they build the stations cut and cover, and Stockholm instead uses drill and blast, and mines the stations. Now, normally drill and blast is supposed to be more labor intensive than a TBM. TBMs are more automated. However, TBMs are also not very reliable. They so Eric, Elif, you sat in on the same interview with me with Norbillion. What did we say the uptime of the best TBMs was? Was it the best TBMs are 1/3 uptime or something like that?
The best is 40%, but it's much more likely to be in the 20s. And I think for Second Avenue subway phase 1, it was like 23%, if memory serves correctly. But the very best is 40%, which is not common. Yeah, 1/3 would be very good, according to all the people we've spoken to.
Yeah. So I will say that I've heard that the next possible expansion in Stockholm might still use tunnel boring machines. And it's possible that the drill and blast is something very specific to Stockholm's geology. It's very hard rock. It's gneiss. I don't mean nice like NIC, I mean nice, GNEISS, which forms a natural arch. The stations are have this kind of beautiful exposed rock. So
I say conveniently enough, that also is nice, NICE, right?
Yes,
because the
it is convenient. But,
yes, there you go.
Yeah, and so so I don't know if this means that more people should be using drill and blast instead of TBMs when Stockholm is considering going back to TBMs. The issue is that TBMs automate a lot of the drilling and the blasting, but because they constantly break down, you still need to pay the workers when they're not working. Like you still need to pay workers. You're hiring a worker for a period of time. The worker doesn't stop getting paid when the machine breaks down. So now again, just on the engineering level, also the stations are mined. This does increase cost. Again, just because I'm using another Nordic example constantly, Fornebubanen is also mined, and I was told that this is one of the reasons it's so expensive. Whereas typically you would expect cut and cover stations. So maybe it's not purely optimized. But for example, the entry holes might be a little bit of a cut and cover, and then beneath the cut and cover hole, you would mine the rest of the station. Now, it's really important to make sure that you have good access points, that you don't need to, for example, demolish a lot of expensive buildings. Some of the construction is in the city center of Stockholm with very high land values. You're not going to start demolishing large parts of Södermalm. And so, for example, the most central Södermalm, station in Sofia is elevator access only, just because they could not easily fit an escalator. It's that deep. It's 100 meters below ground level, just because of the local topography. So because it's elevator access only, they figured that would be okay for normal capacity, but it's not enough for emergency, because you need to be able to evacuate the entire. You need to be able to evacuate the entire train, maybe 2 trains that are in opposite directions at once if there's a fire, and you should assume that these are full trains. And so they figured that instead of building, so for example, in the United States, the kind of practice about this is to build large mezzanines as kind of intermediate locations for refuge. I believe they also do that in China, right? The full-length mezz.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So instead, what they're doing in Sofia is they're using the access tunnel, the access service tunnels that were used to mine the cavern. They're just leaving them open for emergency use, because they can still be using that. So I'm talking about Neo-Tunnelbahn, but I will also say that the mining in for city Bahnen, again, it's something that's kind of unavoidable for city center control tunnels. This is why, again, they tend to be more expensive than metros per kilometer. And but the mining, for example, seems, I won't say minimalistic, but I don't mean it's very brutalist architecture with no features to it. No, the stations are pretty artistic. No, what I mean is that they don't seem to build more than they have to. The station digs are very close to just the length of the train platform. You don't dig what you don't need to. Now, I mentioned before that maybe you don't want to use TBMs. Or again, it's a specific contextual thing. I'm not going to say other cities should stop using TBMs, but it's really important to minimize how many workers you're using, because Sweden, this should have a bigger paragraph. Sweden is a rich country. Sweden, I wouldn't say it's a unionized country, but it's not. But these workers are often not long-standing union members. I don't think all of them are unionized. Quite a lot of them are foreign migrant workers. And if you're wondering whether that reduces wages, maybe it does. But I was told that the wages to the miners, so the ones who are actually underground, are 70,000 kronor per month before taxes, so about 90,000 US dollars a year. This includes benefits. I mean, it's Sweden. You get the usual, basically free Swedish healthcare. Because this is entirely migrant workforce, it gets housing as a benefit. So they live in temporary worker housing. The worker housing is usually not terrible. There has been friction about the quality of the housing, but the stuff that, for example, was mentioned in a report in a union report by LO about how this might be used to undermine unionized labor. They do mention the stuff they mention about the housing quality is, again, it's not kind of your stereotype of like of a migrant worker in Qatar or in the UAE or in Singapore, not at all. And the other issue is that some of them do join unions. I mean, obviously the contractors start to, the contractors management try to prevent them, but some of them do unionize. In Oslo, actually, there's been a lot of unionization of Eastern European migrant workers. Maybe less so in Copenhagen and Stockholm and somewhere in between, but this is, again, a workforce that is not poorly paid. And for example, Elif, you mentioned, I forget whether in the case or to me when I asked you about how in Turkey it's very different, right? In Turkey, the wages are low and there's very little worker empowerment, right?
Yes, I mean, most of the workers are not unionized and labor is very cheap, but also white collar, like professional services are very cheap as well.
Yeah, and so think about the way about maximizing labor efficiency this way. Citibanen, according to LO, 23% of the contract value was labor, and I believe Turkey is about a similar percentage, and Italy is about the same percentage. So the fact that Sweden manages to maintain a similar labor ratio, and bear in mind, yes, Citibanen is not the world's cheapest, but I mean, again, it's a complex regional rail tunnel. Istanbul's comparable, actually probably much more difficult project, Marmaray, was also, by Istanbul standards, very expensive. So the fact that they keep it to 23% is notable. So what is the problem? So as I said, the construction costs are low, but they're rising. Now, the cost overrun, there's a list of internal reasons. For example, at one point, they changed the regulations to require a third bore, not bore, a drilled tunnel. So normally you drill 2 tunnels, right? One for each track. Sometimes you do both tracks in the same larger drill. This is not the case in Stockholm or in most other places. And new safety regulation requires a third one. This is like this kind of escalation of safety rules that don't necessarily have clear benefits is not unique to Sweden. The United States has much of that problem as well. Again, some of the escalating rules have a reason. For example, accessibility laws are getting tighter. This is a good thing. It's a good thing that subways are accessible. It's also a good thing that accessibility is defined in tighter terms, for example, in the standards. I don't remember the Swedish accessibility standards. The Norwegian ones used to be 10% grade, 1 in 10, but at this point, new build has to be 1 in 20, so 5%. So that's part of the problem, but it looks like much of it is procurement. Now, procurement in Sweden is not bad. I'm gonna end by talking about procurement, but I want to make it very clear. The traditional system is not bad. The traditional system did have a lot of problems that are being resolved in a way that is making things worse, though. So traditionally, contracts are itemized. This is a good thing because it means that whenever you have conflict over change orders, you don't need to argue as much. You don't need to litigate because itemization, and there's some literature about this, for example, by Wasserman and Borotny is a good reference on this about how when you itemize, I think they study road projects in Boston, you end up having lower overall costs because it's easier to figure out why the change is happening. Maybe the change is happening because you assumed wages would be X and now wages are Y because of further economic growth. Yeah, that's already in the contract. It's usually already itemized because of union agreements, but you can also itemize much more than that. You can specify quantities and then, or I think it's called fixed price with adjustable quantities, which is you say what the number is, but then you itemize parts of it. And then if there are such changes, again, you don't need to litigate what's happening. You can point out in the contract. This makes things a lot more robust. This is also something that a lot of the contractors hate because they don't want to tell you exactly what they're doing. They're worried about this kind of nitpicking. Maybe they want to get paid earlier is one of the reasons I've heard. So they prefer fixed price. The problem is fixed price means that all the change orders increase their cost dramatically. contracts are to be smaller because there was a very large ecosystem of small contractors. Domestically, they have merged to be globally competitive, so contracts are bigger. This is not necessarily a bad thing. I want to make it very clear again, Swedish procurement has a lot of problems. Nordic procurement has problems and it's getting worse, but it's not bad. And I don't think the idea of doing bigger contracts is necessarily bad, but I do think it's important because I do want to give context to the kind of procurement strategy, which is designed to be more globally competitive. So one of the ways they're doing it is to give contracts that are big enough that a Spanish contractor or a Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Turkish, German contractor would be willing to actually study up on how to build things in Sweden on Swedish peculiarities, just to just to be able to get maybe a $300 million contract and not a $50 million contract. It was the small domestic firms that preferred small contracts, but again, these domestic firms are being outcompeted. There's also a transition from design to build, or what is called just build contracts. So to design build, which is supposed to reduce conflict, but it also is designed to be a pure client is the biggest thing. So by pure client, I mean less in-house design, less in-house planning, and much more being a client to other people. This is a very Anglo thing. The documents that recommended this from the 2000s and early 10s looked up a lot to Britain and to the Netherlands, and these are high-cost countries. They did not look at, let's say, lower-cost Southern European models. So there's always this kind of problem with who gets the risk. And probably the best practice is to have the risk on the public sector. There's a move to privatize risk, and this is not a good thing because there's always risk compensation. You tell a contractor that they're bearing the risk, they're just going to bid higher. It's a big problem also when you combine private risk with not design build, but the more traditional design bid build. It's a problem. I know in Fornebubanen, one of the problems is that when you have a risky line, if the risk is distributed improperly, you're going to have a lot of defensive design. So things like, instead of let's design and see during construction if we need to waterproof, you force them to waterproof everything in advance, even if it turns out to be unnecessary, just because if it is necessary, the onus is maybe on the wrong entity. Maybe it's the designer, maybe the builder. It should be on the public sector either way. And constantly, as I said, there was this move in this peripheral in the peripheral Anglosphere to change procurement. In Canada, they moved to design build in the 2000s. They adopted much of this recently, and costs exploded. And I worry that the same kind of thing is happening in the Nordic countries. Now, the Nordic countries are starting with much better bureaucracy on this. Trafikverket's pure client model is not supposed to be a dumb pure client, it's supposed to be an informed pure client. So they just said that they're going to pick, I think, 3 sections of railway that they're going to, of national railway that are going to maintain themselves and contract out everything else, because the idea is that you should contract out the state and the state should just be a client. But the idea is to do a little bit themselves just to be able to benchmark. So if you have to do this kind of privatization of this, you probably want to have these kinds of moves that retain some public sector expertise, some public sector, ideally public sector innovation, just because the construction costs are mostly a matter of, what country you're in. So maybe it's not private sector but public sector innovation. Like a big thing about this model is to try to do private sector innovation. But if you're forced to do that, maybe you should at least have some kind of public sector expertise. I'm going to stop here and see if people are having questions in chat or in the Q&A. So there's a Q&A and there's a chat, and you can write us. And if it's something that I don't know the answer to, then either Eric and Elif can give you the answer, or we're just going to tell you we don't know. I mean, there's a vast amount of information, including about things we've done pretty deep dives into that we don't know. So thank you for this, and I can't make any promises about the time of other people. I'm staying here for at least another hour if people have questions. This is like, I have a lot of stamina for this kind of thing. So let's see what people are asking. Okay, the Q&A. Okay. Oh, Connor. Okay. Can we enable
Alon, let me just interrupt. I answered a question from Arpit Gupta about work from home. I don't know if you can see it. If you want to take that question too, that was the first question. But I left Connor's question, and Jessica has a question also about Sweden for you.
Yes. Okay. So. Okay, Thomas, yours is easy. I am going to sanitize this presentation because the clicks, you may have noticed that like each line is a separate click. So what I do is I eliminate that so that people can read the PDF, and then I post them on my blog. I expect this to be live in a few hours because I also want to upload the report.
And we're also going to post the video recording of this.
Yeah. Okay, Connor. Suburbs of Nordic cities, you say that they have a much higher proportion of low density single family residential. Does this impact construction? Well, usually it's not, the construction is not done through single family zones. I mean, sometimes to get to other places. But for example, Barkarby, yes, it has single family, but there's a lot of this kind of grading between some slightly denser, so somewhere between missing middle and mid-rise, and just open space. And a lot of the TOD is an open space. It's so there's so my understanding of Swedish YIMBYism, of which there's quite a lot. Sweden, like literally the expression YIMBY as a movement for permitting more urban housing was invented in Sweden. YIMBY Stockholm was, I believe, the first to use that the expression YIMBY about building more urban housing, as opposed to just in general being in favor of infrastructure projects that other people object to. My understanding is that what they do is they find land to build mid-rise housing on. So there's very little high-rise. Stockholm, I believe Stockholm has 5 skyscrapers, right? Stockholm, I believe central Stockholm has 5. It has a quintuplet of skyscrapers, or something like 70 or 80 meters tall, around just north of Sergelstorget, around Hötorget. They're incredibly ugly. It's kind of like 1950s, 60s, 70s kind of modernism, and then maybe there are kind of more recent edge city skyscrapers where they're outside the historic preservation zones in Kista. But they, but even so, there's a lot of density that is just not high rise. And for example, Sofia is being built in a park in a high density, near center, very wealthy area, Södermalm. Jessica, you are asking why is Sweden moving toward this kind of more globalized model? This is an excellent question. It's a bunch of answers, and kind of like pick which of them you prefer. So first of all, the traditional model does have problems. One of the things that has been cited in a lot of the work on this, which is cited in our actual report on our website. So again, it's on transitcost.com, you can get to the Sweden case. And one of the things they've cited is that construction productivity in Sweden is growing extremely slowly, only 0.8% per year. The Swedish economy is growing much faster than that. I think something like 1.5% a year. So they figured that in order to unleash innovation, they needed to change things. Now, from maybe more globally comparative perspective, I can tell you that 0.8% growth is not bad. In the United States, construction productivity in the last 40 years has grown, I believe, at a negative rate. I don't fully know the literature on this. It's possible that I'm overwriting two specific papers on this that were widely cited in the Financial Times because they said construction productivity is decreasing, and this is maybe sufficiently curious that it would be covered in the Financial Times. But but again, there have been this kind of model, this kind of problems with construction productivity that is not growing as fast as they would like. The existing risk management situation did interact poorly with the traditional system, leading to conflict between designers and builders, and ultimately to defensive design. So there's kind of this belief that design build is more modern, that big corporate is more modern, but it's also somewhat ideological. I think it's just kind of this ideological idea that the state is inefficient and the market is efficient, and you should marketize infrastructure. And this is where I'm seeing all these reports that only look at Northern Europe. So they maybe compare. So there are always these Nordic comparisons. The Nordics learn from each other. But if they learn from something that's not Scandinavia, what do they learn from? Other Northern Europe, especially the UK, because it's easy to read it in English, maybe possibly Germany. I did not see in the when I looked at the changes in how they're doing procurement of construction and maintenance, I didn't see any references to Southern Europe. I did not see any references to, let's say, France. So it's kind of a combo of an ideology that maybe looks at this kind of marketization as more modern, which again is not an ideology. Like, they didn't take utopia and break it. They took something that was like, and neither did Canada, by the way. In Canada, they didn't take a perfect system and break it. In Canada, they took a system that was already seeing cost increases, and they changed it in a way that produced further cost increases. And then each change is because these changes are generally for the worse. In Canada, I can tell you what they've done, which is that they've motivated more politicization. So more and more politicization of planning decisions. This has not happened in the Nordic country that I know. It remains depoliticized to the extent that it intersects with any kind of politics. It's something sporadic. It's something like maybe in Norway they build more in rural areas, and the rural areas are maybe more important voters. But that's just, I mean, Norway ideologically likes, and it's kind of a national thing for Norway to try to do this kind of geographic equity, and Sweden is the exact opposite. So again, they didn't take utopia and break it. They took a system that had problems, and they changed it in a way that generally when there's a problem, when there's a recession, you vote for a different party. And whether you vote for a party that's more to the left or more to the right of what's available depends on what you believe in, if that makes sense. Thomas. Okay, so thank you so much for this, Thomas. I like these kinds of examples. I will say that it's very hard to do to properly measure benefits, and this is why I think the benefit cost ratios. And it's also, I mean, so I'm getting also an anonymous question, so I'm going to answer kind of both at the same time. The issue with this kind of benefit cost analysis is that there are benefits that are just hard to capture. I will say that the big transit projects have been pursued at lower benefit cost ratios on paper, but again, these are mega projects. You can do a benefit cost ratio of a mega project that's maybe not a mega project relative to your country anymore, if that makes sense. So for example, for France to build a new high-speed line is not a mega project. It's a very big project. It's many billions of euros. But it's something that France has done before. It can be compared with existing lines. It is something that is not going to be, I mean, none of these infrastructure projects is ever existential, but it's something that nobody's even going to pretend is existential to build a high-speed line to Bordeaux or to Toulouse. It's not a once-in-a-generation thing. It's part of a long-standing program. When you're building the first expansion of the T-Bana in almost 30 years, over more than 30 years. I think it's going to be between the opening of the most recent expansion in 94 and when the first section of Newton-Bana opens. When something is that generational, it's very difficult, I think, to measure benefits. If you try to do it something dumb like cost per rider, it looks like the benefits are well above water, and then the actual benefit cost ratio gives you a very different answer, and that's already a question of, okay, how do you count these benefits? I mean, there's very long list of how everything is to be counted. It's done this way in Britain. It's done this way in the Nordic countries, where they secretly say, okay, these benefits are to be measured at this discount rate. The discount rate might be different for different benefits. Things about value of time. So it's very, so it's very, so it's very much maybe, I don't want to say more an art than a science, but there are parts of it that are art, and there are parts of it where the science, even if it's a science, there are competing scientific theories sometimes. I mean, scientists disagree. I hope that this makes sense. Like, it doesn't look like there's a big mode warrior issue within traffic verket about road versus transit. There is, I will say, I mentioned politics before. My understanding is that the right in Sweden is substantially more pro-road than the left. It's at many different levels. So, for example, one of the motivating factors for the Swedish right is kind of this kind. So some of it is the usual, economic arguments, but there has been a lot of kind of emotional dislike of Greta Thunberg, and a lot of, oh, let's own the Greens mentality. Which again, it's not purely popular. It's also like a belief in roads as kind of economic development. And Sweden is also building roads. Stockholm is building highway tunnels through a city center from the congestion pricing money, because the political agreement, again, the alliance was in charge when this was made, when this decision was made, was to send most of the congestion pricing money not to public transport, which is what the Social Democrats wanted, but to these kind of highway tunnels. So this kind of road versus transit in Sweden is partly also political. It's who wins the election. And there's a very big left versus right difference in this. And I was told that there's no consensus yet on whether to build high-speed rail in Sweden, but it's likelier under a left coalition than under a right coalition. The right would be interested in funding electric cars. I hope that answers your question. Jessica, you're asking me if the Swedish government has engaged with my research. I don't know. I mean, not yet, but I don't know how well we've publicized it, so I don't know. I mean, if I write something in an extreme case, if I write something in a diary, you should not ask if the government has heard of it. So we're only now doing a launch. We're going to do a full launch of everything, including the New York case, sometime next month. So I don't know. So I don't know which governments are going to respond in what way. I mean, I hope that they engage more. I can't tell at this rate. As I said, I'm going to be here for a while. I will stop if nobody has any questions, because I don't think people want to just see me either ad lib too much or be very stoically silent. But if people, as I said, if people have questions, I'm here probably until longer than you are. I do reserve the right to stop at 7 my time. 1 yours if you're from the Eastern US. Follow up. Are there specific policy proposals that I have? Yes, we have specific policy proposals. Thank you for that question, Jessica. Eric, Elif, do you want to chime in as well? Because this gets to something a lot broader than just Sweden.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in as it sort of arises. But if you want to get started with, I mean, we have like, you know, I don't know what the exact number is right now, 12 sort of recommendations.
Yeah.
And they run the gamut from sort of design type decision issues to things of decision making, governance. And I think across our cases, you know, they're just different governance type issues of who makes decisions about what gets built, where it gets built, and how it gets built. And so I think, you know, we across our, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 cases, depending on how you count. You know, I think
I would call it 5 just because of, yeah, the Italian case is 3 cities. It's Milano, Torino, and Rome, but
and Naples.
And Naples, but Naples is somewhat divergent from the rest of Italy. Again, sure. If there's divergence, there's a reason. In Naples, in Napoli, the costs are higher. I believe it's for geological reasons. It's not.
That's it. And procurement.
And procurement and right. Procurement issues. I think it's because it's a line that was much of it was procured back in the era when there was much more corruption.
Yeah.
Italy is actually a really good example of how you reduce costs, because in Italy, the problem in the 70s and 80s was just criminal corruption. The politicians took bribes. Criminal corruption, there's a way to solve that. You prosecute the politicians, which Italy did. Half of parliament was under indictment. All of the major parties were destroyed. All of the Italian political parties that exist today are post-1990s or 1990s and later remnants. That did reduce construction costs. Now, in Sweden, is there criminal corruption? No, not at that scale. Sweden is a very clean country. Sweden has different problems. So with procurement, so first of all, I don't think design build is necessarily good. I used to be very anti-design build. I no longer am. I think that it doesn't look like design build hurts very much, but I also don't think it helps. I think the important thing is not to be a pure client. I would say that it's actually important to do the exact opposite. So the pure client model of Trafikverket and peer Nordic agencies is superior, not to the previous model of the Nordic countries, but to the rendering of pure client in, let's say, Britain or whatever is done in the United States. So it is important to have that public sector innovation, public sector expertise. This means, again, at the very minimum, if you have to outsource everything, at least do a few things in-house so that you know not to get overcharged, not to get shortchanged, not to even sometimes the overcharging is not even dishonest. Sometimes it's just right. I wouldn't say right hand not talking to left. Sometimes it's an octopus with 8 tentacles, and none of the 8 tentacles talks to the others. Is how things often end up. So instead of that, you do want to be somewhat more state-led. You do want to have more public sector expertise, more in-house planning and design, even if the design does employ some private consultants, even if potentially to do design build. I mean, Turkey is not full design build. Turkey does do 2 contracts, but the build contract also includes a pretty big element of design. You do want to, in general, if you don't do design build, you want to make sure that you always want to make sure that the risk is public sector, not private sector.
And I mean, often, I guess, sorry to interrupt, but like when we talk about procurement methods, it always, like we always end up saying, it doesn't matter which you use, it matters how you do it. And I think Istanbul is a good example of that. Like in terms of they do use design build, but they have an initial contract where they procure a 60% design document. So they outsource that. That's like private sector designers, but still that gives the agency the knowledge to oversee the rest of the process. And I mean, it does kind of work like design bid build, but the next step, the next contract is a lot more like it allows for a lot more flexibility. It allows the contractor to innovate. So like they can actually go back and make changes on that first 60% design.
Yep.
So I mean, it can work, right? There are examples where design build works well too. But the way you use it is important.
Yeah, so with two contracts, and also it's something that I read in Spain, their explanation for why they itemize the contracts rather than going fixed price is that they want to retain that kind of flexibility to vary from the design with the builder. So you want to be flexible. You want to make sure the builder can very easily change things based on meter scale geology, based on random things like you don't know what the relative materials costs are going to be like. You do not want to micromanage what materials the builders are going to use, because at the end of the day, passengers aren't going to really care if so there need to be, let's say, a bench at the station so people can sit. You might want to specify, so there's something called functional procurement in Sweden, which is supposed to be more flexible, but in practice hasn't actually delivered on the flexibility because railways, okay, we can say we need a railway with this capacity, but it's extensions of the metro. You can't just say we need that capacity. You need to build the actual metro. But I mean, in general, things like not micromanaging the materials. So the passengers care about the bench. They don't care if the bench is made of metal, concrete, or wood. So the decision can be made very late in construction based on just spot prices for commodities or which trades workers are easier to find. And so you want that kind of flexibility, and that flexibility is something that requires you to itemize if you do changes. It also requires you to it also requires you, again, if you do design build, maybe it's different. If you do design bid build, it requires you to make sure that the builders can change the design a little bit. And it's kind of the synthesis where I think the design bid build systems that are most likely to be replaced by design build are the least flexible ones. So the Nordic one, where the builders are disincentivized to change anything from the design, and the designers know that, and designers know this, so they over design. Likewise, I know that in the American system, changes are very difficult because any change leads to litigation. Litigation is uncertain for both sides, and the uncertainty essentially raises costs. These would be my main recommendation for procurement. It'd be things around spot flexibility, around again making sure that you can't bind the building years in advance when it's a complex underground project. You never know what you're going to find there. Making sure the risk remains public sector, which means the public sector needs to be informed. The public sector needs to be staffed by people who have built these projects with some kind of continuity of engineering, which is very difficult to establish when you're doing it anew. But I mean, again, New Tunnelbanan is after in theory, 30-year pause, in practice, a much longer pause, and the costs are not extreme. In Copenhagen, the first metro line cost probably about like New Tunnelbanan, so not like the old Nordic cost, but like the new Nordic costs. It's something you can establish. It's just, it does require you, I think, to not excessively privatize the site. Again, you can, I mean, the construction is never done by the site. The construction is done by private contractors. The design, it's usually stayed with a lot of private contractors, private consultant assistants. But you want to have, again, you want to retain this kind of public sector expertise, this public sector institutional knowledge. And if you don't have it, which the United States sadly kind of doesn't. And remember, in New York is not a lost art of a city that built things cheaply once and no longer does. The construction costs in today's money in 1930s New York were not much lower than the construction costs of New Tunnelbanan and higher than the construction costs of Nordic subways from 10 years ago. And that was and that was relative to the New York City of the Great Depression. At the time, it was a factor of 4 premium over London and Paris. In New York, it's not a matter of, so in a place like in the United States, it's not maybe a matter of retaining expertise. Sometimes like this, you want to retain it, but sometimes building it from scratch. And that is harder. Does that answer your question, Jessica?
Oh.
Awesome. Okay, are there other questions? And again, if there aren't any, I can just stop. As I said, I think people do want to watch us talk about issues related to public transport, infrastructure, and construction costs, but awkward silences are probably not what draws the audience. No, they're in the QA. Oh, Connor, you're asking about other Nordic countries. Are the causes of cost rises similar in Sweden? Probably. So let me explain by what I mean when I say probably. I haven't studied the other Nordics in as much detail as I have Sweden, but the ENO Center it's studied Copenhagen. ENO has its own report on this, which I love. I think there's one glaring issue there, which is that they talk about design build more positively. Why do they talk about design build more positively? So our Nordic case is Stockholm. Theirs is Copenhagen. As far as I can tell, Copenhagen always used the modern, more globalized system and not the traditional one. Because again, the metro in Copenhagen opened maybe 20 years ago. So they never had, so yes, Copenhagen is kind of state-led development in the 50s, but they didn't build subways with it. And so, for example, Copenhagen, I believe you design build from the start. It also did creative financing. You want to finance everything out of general taxes. And the reason is that nobody likes paying general taxes. And Connor, I know where you work. This is it's going to go on YouTube. It's a kind of threat. It's a public thing. Connor works for the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute constantly slugs on, for example, over taxation in New York. If you need to spend, I don't know, $10 billion or something on infrastructure in New York, you want the taxes. You don't want to hide the 10 billion from the taxpayer, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the 10 billion comes from taxpayers in some kind of configuration. If you hide it from the taxpayers, it's easier to say, "Oh, I didn't realize you left a month ago." Oh, okay. And so anyway, if it is a very obnoxious tax, this is going to discipline the politicians to make sure the $10 billion stay 10 or maybe become 12 and do not become 20. Copenhagen used tax increment financing, so very opaque. I don't think they had a big cost. I shouldn't say they didn't have a cost overrun. I don't know if they did. I just know the final cost was, again, comparable to 2020s Scandinavia in the early and mid 2000s, and not comparable to early 2010 Scandinavia. I have heard about procurement problems with in Oslo, so big increase in cost from Lørenbanen to Fornebubanen. In Helsinki, likewise, very large, almost factors of 2, I think, increase in cost from the first phase to the second phase of the West Metro, of Länsi Metro. I know I'm not pronouncing the Finnish correctly. So this is, and I've read the procurement documents that are sometimes pan-Nordic comparisons, and sometimes from other Nordic countries. So they do have a similar attitude, trying to figure out how to contract out things better. Quite a lot of things that are done in-house, even in the United States, are contracted out in Europe, and the Nordic countries are no exception. Nordic socialism is not everything is run by the state. Nordic socialism is traditionally the state plans and contracts out to the private sector, and increasingly it's more the state contracts out even the planning to the private sector. And maybe it's the latter part that doesn't work very well. Oh, I'm getting another anonymous question. Does Helsinki have a similar geology to Stockholm? I believe so. I believe Helsinki is also nice. I do not know whether they do, like, I don't know how they build in Helsinki. I imagine that Länsimetro is built drill and blast. And the reason I imagine this is because they have underwater sections that make it difficult to, let's say, cut and cover anything. But I do not know. But yes, Helsinki has similar geology to Stockholm. Oslo doesn't. I believe in Oslo, parts of it have a similar geology, but I believe Lørenbanen was different. They built Løren station couldn't cover. And of course, Copenhagen is completely different. For a while, we thought maybe Copenhagen is more expensive because of soil. Probably not. Jonathan. Yeah, so you're talking about how it's important to tunnel through bedrock. Yeah. And this is a big. Oh, okay. Do I think that? Okay, you're asking me if there's this kind of tunnel visioning about finding other cost-effective solutions. Yes, definitely. Sometimes you save money on one aspect and unwittingly blow up the budget on other things. So for example, if you go too deep, that makes the TBM or the drill and blast much easier. I was told that this is one reason why Second Avenue subway is bored so deep, and Second Avenue subway goes beneath Second Avenue, which is a wide, straight street where they could have done cut and cover. New York City did cut and cover more than 100 years ago on streets of that width with 4 tracks. Second Avenue subway is only 2 tracks. The problem is that when you instead build deep underground to make the tunnel a little cheaper, you make the stations much more expensive. No, I do know that Stockholm does not have as big of a problem with expensive stations. The construction cost of the two, I don't know what the construction cost of the Nötenbanen stations are. I know the 2 for Citybanen, Stockholm City and Udenplan. They were not especially expensive. I think they were maybe 150 or 200, maybe they were $200 million each, which, just to put things in perspective for you, I mean, Second Avenue subway stations are 600 or 700. The Second Avenue subway is 75% station costs. No, more than 75% station costs. I think the hard costs are more than 80% stations. This is not at all the case for Citybanen. So maybe you actually can mine, but when do mine stations, the costs are higher. I don't know the multiplier for Fornebubanen, but I do know that for Second Avenue subway, the decision to mine some stations, it looks like a 50% cost increase from mining versus cut and cover stations. So yeah, maybe with Elfre, so it looks like Elfre is doing the right thing by trying to do a more standard. It's supposed to be what, TBMs and then cut and cover stations, but so again, looks to me like the right thing to do, but the geology might be such that it's still better to drill and blast. I cannot tell. And of course, TBMs are highly automated things that work when technology wants to work. So think about it this way. I was offline for what, 10 minutes at the beginning of the presentation, 5 minutes for the beginning of the presentation when I froze. And this is IT technology that is where if your uptime falls below 99%, people curse out the computer and decide that low tech is the best or something. Again, TBMs break down all the time. When they work, they're great. The rest of the 2/3 of the time, maybe not. So so I'm not gonna say what is better, drill and blast or TBMs, and this is something where I would trust the technocrats at SLL about this.
The one thing I'd add on TBM versus drill and blast is also you can throw more bodies at drill and blast, and you can build in sections, and you can sort of you can stage things differently, which I think is quite interesting.
Yes.
As you know, TBM is much less flexible in that regard.
Yeah, with TBMs, essentially you have to build multiple TBMs to do this in sections, which I mean, it's fine. You can do multiple TBMs, but each TBM has to be launched. And usually the issue with the TBM is that the TBM is cheap and then launching it is expensive.
Yes.
So there is a kind of time money trade-off there to some extent.
Absolutely. I think in Madrid, in that 90s expansion, they had like 30 TBMs or something like that. And you know, I know in Istanbul they've run a bunch, but Second Avenue is just one TBM.
Yeah,
and,
Shanghai was many TBMs. There was this quote from, was it Lee Sanders? Lee Sanders, and so it would have been late 2000s New York when he was, I think he was saying that I think it was saying something like New York had 4 active TBMs because of, I think it was Second Avenue plus East Side Accident for what else, and then he said in Shanghai
seven extension had 2 TBMs. East Side Access has had 2, but Second Avenue was only 1. East Side Access and 7 both had more than 1.
Oh, okay. So I believe he said that there were 4, but maybe I'm forgetting the number. Was, if I'm wrong, then it didn't say it was 12. Wrong, it said
I mean, there might have been 4 because one of them was whatever. Who knows?
Yeah, and then he says, I believe he says in Shanghai that there were 90. So this is, so in Shanghai, very rapid expansion. Also, spending money to avoid spending time is a big thing in Chinese construction. He says in high speed rail as well. They essentially build their high speed rail on stilts, which is expensive, but can be sometimes faster to build than assembling land forever.
I've been looking at sort of the Lannis Metro construction. I'm going to say drill and blast for the tunnel, just based on how it's being described. They're talking about, you know, bolting and shotcrete, and you know, obviously, you would not do that with a TBM.
With a TBM, yeah. So Lannis Metro would be okay. As I said, I don't know. I mean, I know even about Stockholm. I know some things, but the depth of what I don't know is they have special submarines to explore that. Okay, are there other questions? Or maybe there's a question that I didn't answer adequately. I'm not sure. Okay. Oh, Laurie, what do I think about? Oh, about publicity. Yeah. Okay, Laurie, this is a very good question. We have seen elsewhere that optimizing for cost overruns can raise overall costs. So what do I mean? It means maybe putting the it means maybe building more contingency into your budget because you don't want, because you think, oh, that they say that it can be built for €1 billion, so let's budget it at 1.4 so that if it runs over, people won't say the politicians promised 1 and it's 1.4. They'll say, no, the politicians promised 1.4 and it's 1.4. But the problem is contingencies will never not be spent. If €1 is in the budget, the €1 will be spent. If it looks like it doesn't need to be spent, someone will find a special thing that is necessary, some kind of community improvement. And the result is that optimize, and then there's the issue of putting the onus of the risk on the private sector. So much of it is people reacting to cost overruns by trying to reduce the overrun, and that's been mostly a success. I mean, in some places, for example, in the United States, there no longer are cost overruns on the average light rail project. There were big ones in the 80s. By the early 2000s, on average, I mean, there are some projects with cost overruns, but on average, the budget is what the planners say, the ridership is what the planners say. Just that the absolute costs have exploded due to defensive design, due to trying to anticipate every problem that could occur rather than doing them on the fly, due to improper risk, which just means that the private bidders bid higher. So yeah, all of this is something that can happen. It's an excellent question. Thank you, Abby. Oh, okay, yeah, okay, that makes sense. If Finland has not used the TBM so far. Oh, Connor, you're asking about the remote road tunnels in Norway. Sure, but a lot of the non-physical. So first of all, a lot of the soft costs are just going to be different if it's not in the city. Second, I don't like just looking at tunnels, and the reason is that if it's just a tunnel and you don't have stations, then a lot of the hard parts are already not parts of the project. Now, there are projects that are supposed to be exclusively easy parts and are still extremely expensive. But I try to look at complex urban tunnels. And when I say complex urban tunnels, I mean things that are literally Marmarai. I mean, yes, this is a literal transcontinental tunnel in a deep channel with strong currents and periodic earthquakes, and then the parts that are not underwater but underground go underneath sections of Istanbul that I thought that it was just on the European side that it's things that are from the early Byzantine era. And then I realized that Chalcedon, as in Chalcedonian Christianity, it's literally Kadıköy. It's literally like right on the Asian side. So when you tunnel through places that are literally like entire branches of like or the entire dogmas of the Christian religion are named after, because that was the seat of the Roman Empire, then yeah, that's going to be extremely expensive, but by local standards. But we look at things. So again, we don't just look at that, but we look at things of the complexity level of again, Tunnelbahn, Grand Paris Express, the U-Bahn tunnels that Berlin is building, or the U-Bahn tunnels Berlin is not what should be building. I worry about looking at purely outside urban area examples, because I mean, obviously the wages aren't going to be different in Norway because it's the same mobile workforce. This is very different from the United States, where the workforce is, I'm not going to say is perfectly mobile, but is less mobile. But it is going to be in other ways, I think, easier. I mean, for example, moving materials. I mean, you move the materials either by barge, which I don't think is expensive, or you just truck them to the roadside. How are you moving materials into Sofia? But you literally need to dig long axis shafts, just horizontal axis shaft, just to move materials from the highways around Södermalm to Sofia. So this is, for example, why I'm reticent to look at things that are purely outside metropolitan areas, if that makes sense. Are there questions that we've missed, or are there new questions? Again, I have at least 20 more minutes here. Other than people can, after that, people can go home. Mostly so that I don't need to upload another 6-hour video to YouTube that nobody's going to watch. But I'm going to wait another minute. If not, then we can end it. But by the way, Eric, are there things that I've missed about TCP in general?
No, while you were
I know I was gone for a couple of minutes.
While you were gone, I think I ad-libbed appropriately enough about that, because when you fell off, you were talking about sort of being in New York and sort of what generated our interest in all of this. And so I think I completed that thread somewhat appropriately. And then I talked about some of our, new stuff that we're doing, high-speed rail, IBX, New York case, and then the sort of that those things are all sort of working their way through the pipeline right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So thanks to everyone for sticking around for a rather long lecture. Usually they're supposed to be an hour, and this has been an hour 40 with the Q&A. So thank you. This is not the last of DCP because we are doing a big launch of the New York case in a month and change, I think. And there's going to be a lot about the interface later between high-speed rail and commuter rail, for example. It's a big, it could be physical interface, it can be planning interface. In the case of the Northeast corridor in the United States, has to be total integration of everything there. You basically can't build high-speed rail on purely separated tracks. You need to do a combo of separated and shared tracks. We're doing the IBX project. This is, New Yorkers know what it is. People who are watching who are not from New York. If you know Stockholm, IBX is Tvärbanan. It's a, and if you're from New York, Tvärbanan is IBX. It's a line in a mostly disused, but still enough freight transport that it's not just going to fully abandon the freight. That is kind of orbital in Brooklyn, Queens, and provide and is like advocates have wanted to reuse it for orbital subway service, even extending up into the Bronx for maybe 25 years. And I think maybe last year, was it last year or this year? This year, last year, the governor was.
It was at the start of 2022. The governor made an announcement saying that we're going to go forward.
The governor
and released,
that she wants. Yeah, so in New York, it's a very politicized thing. So if the governor says, "Ooh, this is my signature project," then it's likely to happen.
And the feasibility study had been going on earlier, but yeah.
Whereas in Stockholm, it would never be. The governor said so it's happening. It's going to be. The planners are recommending this, but it's uncertain. So the government either says we like or we don't like. And they're not going to pick a specific mega project like that level of menu picking and say this is our signature. As a big difference, so they would recommend other people imitate Sweden on this. Very big difference on policy matters, left, right. Not as much local level tightness, if that makes sense. So stuff about how it's being built, like how we can implement recommendations for it. The development issue, how to do proper TOD near that line. And so that is also on the program. Other than that, I think we're done, right? Or is there a last minute question? If not, then thanks everyone for watching, whether you're here with us in person or watching the recording. And as I said, we're not done. We will see you with more events in the near future.
And thank you, Alon. Thank you for doing all of this.
Yes, thank you, Alon.